Hello, welcome to the sixth lecture on Shakespeare's Hamlet. Remember, there are going to be a total of 12 lectures altogether. If you view all 12, you earn an extra credit point. Today, let's turn to Hamlet's fourth soliloquy, the to be or not to be soliloquy. I'm at Act 3, Scene 1 in your textbooks. That's on page 1438 beginning at the top of the page with line 56, Hamlet's fourth soliloquy, and the most famous of his soliloquies, the to be or not to be soliloquy. To be or not to be, that is the question. And once again, we see Hamlet lost in thought. I've argued that this is one of the deterministic factors that causes Hamlet to delay in avenging his father's death. Um, Here he is ruminating, philosophizing once again. He's pondering existence, life, death, and suicide. To be or not to be? That is the question. Notice that is the question. All of his thinking, all of his reflections have led him to this conclusion that this is the question, the most important of all questions, to be or not to be. This idea of being or not being, of existing or not existing. Why does he feel this way? Why is this the most important question? We see in the next lines here whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. So here we see Hamlet is supporting the comic plot line, the comic plot of the human story. What is of most value for someone who subscribes to I'm sorry, the tragic plot line. I meant to say Hamlet is adhering here to the tragic plot line. He's subscribing to the notion that the thing of most importance is suffering, that life is essentially suffering. Remember, in contrast to the comic plot line, someone who upholds the comic plot line, the comic storyline of of human beings, is that life is intrinsically valuable. It is of most value. Life in and of itself is valuable. Hamlet here appears to disagree. What is of real value is suffering. I made the argument last time that someone who who supports the tragic plot line, would argue that life itself, in and of itself, life inherently has no real value, that it has only projected value. It's an addiction. Like, I think I made the analogy like uh, heroin in and of itself, the drug heroin has no real value. It's merely an addiction. It has value only to the addict, to the heroin addict, the drug addict. And so with life, according to a person who uh, uh, believes in the tragic uh, story, the idea that we all, conscious feeling organisms, are all addicted to life, to existence, that we come into the world in this state of need, of lack, of desire and want. And we find ourselves in states of dissatisfaction, and that we are continuously striving uh, to escape these various uh, states of dis-ease, of unease, of dissatisfaction, of pain. Remember, if you think of the scale of dissatisfaction, at the bottom of the scale, you can have minor irritations, little annoyances, tiny problems. But at the other end of the scale, you can have unimaginable anguish, torture, uh, horrific pain. So, as functioning organisms, our brains are constantly confronting these dissatisfied states and attempting to resolve, to alleviate the harms that we're experiencing, whether they be the biological drives that motivate us, or the psychological desires, or even our cultural dependencies, what we've become dependent on because we've been raised in a particular culture. So ultimately, life inherently has no meaning. It has no real value, only projected value. So that's an interesting who's there question for extra credit. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? Do you think that do you think that life has in and of itself real value? Uh, or do you agree that it has projected value only? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. So if you'd like, you can respond to that question for extra credit, for an extra credit point, and simply send it to me through Canvas. Mark it extra credit on your email, mark extra credit. So, yes, and again, the question is this idea that suffering, pain, has real value, that each of us knows it has real value. Each of us has experienced suffering and pain. And that's why our brains are constantly striving to escape the whips, if you will, to escape the pain, to escape the problems that we experience. And that life, we become addicted to life in the sense that we become addicted to trying to escape these harms, to alleviate whatever problems may be arising in circumstances that are unfolding. So, pain, suffering, that has real value according to this argument. But life, existence itself, has only projected value. Only that value only exists in the brains of the organisms that have become addicted to it, have become addicted to trying to avoid harm, trying to escape pain. So I'll put that question out there. If you're interested, you can respond for an extra credit point. All right, returning to the soliloquy. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. So here is why Hamlet now subscribes, or why he's pondering this question of to be or not to be, is that he now subscribes to this idea, this notion, that what matters most is suffering. That is what has real value. That is what is of most value. And the question is, should he endure that suffering? Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Notice the battle imagery here, slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Hamlet is at war with suffering. The slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Should he suffer through? Remember, outrageous fortune is the idea that to Hamlet now, remember, he's having difficulty in this world. He's having difficulty perceiving a moral order operating on this planet. He sees the injustices in the world and the unfairness in the world, and so he's confused and he's unable to see his way. Um, So this is the idea of outrageous fortune, where the good are being punished, are being harmed, and the good people are being punished and harmed, and the bad people are being rewarded. This outrageous fortune, and he does see this struggle with suffering as a kind of battle, the slings and arrows. Notice that metaphor, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. So, this first option, he's considering this idea of which is the nobler response. And again, this idea of nobility. Remember, I've argued that this is all important for Hamlet, this idea of integrity, of being of honor, if you will, of being intellectually honest with himself, and striving to be uh, uh, ethically uh, upright, if you will. And so this idea of which is the nobler response to the suffering in the world, to the yes, the pain and the suffering world. Should you suffer? Should you endure the pain? Should you suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or should you take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing in them? And again, that the metaphor here, that taking arms again, picking up, you're right, taking your weapons in hand and resisting, confronting this sea of troubles. Again, the metaphor, he sees life as a sea of troubles. And the sea of troubles again is representing the pain, the harms, the sufferings that existence entails. So, this idea of taking arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing in them, by resisting in them. And of course, the idea here is not that you can defeat the sea of troubles, that you end the sea of troubles by resisting and defeating them. Because if you think about the metaphor of sea of troubles, it's impossible to fight the sea. If you've ever been to the sea or to a large body of water, try next time taking your sword with you and try fighting the sea. Try defeating it with your sword, and you'll see how impossible it is to do. You can't defeat the sea of troubles. The sufferings in life, and ultimately are going to overwhelm you. They will end in that way by opposing in them, by resisting ultimately. You see the irony here. By taking arm against a sea of troubles and by opposing in them, ultimately the sea of troubles will end uh, 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 your your pain and suffering, because you will be defeated in that battle against the sea. They will end in that sense. The sufferings that you confront will ultimately end all suffering. There, I got it out. The sufferings that you confront in life, by resisting them, by opposing them, will ultimately do you in. They will ultimately defeat you. They will vanquish you in the end. You will not be able to survive. But nevertheless, you resist. So you've got this response here. Should you suffer? Should you endure? Or should you oppose? Should you resist? And again, you can see the clash between the cultural codes of Christianity and military honor. Remember, the Christian is exhorted to suffer, to endure, to see suffering as a kind of test, whereas the man of military honor is raised to believe that what makes a man is courage, is bravery, is aggression. So you've got this conflict between the two cultural codes here. And Hamlet, again, has been raised in a culture that endorses both of these codes. And a second way, though, that you could take this idea of taking arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing in them, I would argue here that you could also interpret that as taking arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing in them, is the idea that you could take your own life, end your existence. And again, we're reminded of the cultural code of military honor. If you'll recall, the ancient Greek and the ancient Roman, rather than being the ancient Greek warrior and the ancient Roman warrior, rather than being defeated, being conquered by the enemy, instead, in order to maintain his honor, his nobility, would fall upon his sword, would take his own life. It was suicide for the man of military honor, the man of martial honor. Remember, the chief virtue, the highest virtue for this man is courage, and suicide for the man of martial honor, suicide was perceived as a courageous act. Whereas, once again, for the Christian, suicide is seen as a cowardly act. It's the idea, and as a mortal sin as well, right? Remember, Hamlet, as a Christian, believes in the concept of sin and believes in an afterlife, a Christian heaven and a Christian hell, and the idea that believes in free will, believes that he can freely choose, and therefore is responsible for his actions. And the idea of taking his own life is to uh, uh, is to disobey the Christian God's commandment, and the idea of a creator God, a God that creates, the God alone can destroy what it is he creates. So, suicide, Orthodox Christianity teaches that suicide is a mortal sin and it's punishable by eternal damnation. So, cowardly act, suicide, is it a cowardly act or is it a courageous act? Again, you see the conflict here. But I'm arguing that the second way of looking at the line beginning at, looking at line 60 and by oppose, or line 59, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing in them, could be the idea of taking arms against the sea of troubles, since the sea of troubles can't ultimately be defeated. They can be defeated if one takes one's own life, and therefore the sea of troubles no longer exist for the individual who no longer exists. At any rate, um, you could see that as a third option here, or you could see where he begins at line 60 with the words to die, to sleep. You could see this as the third option, the option of suicide. So you've got these three options, right? The first is to endure suffering, to endure the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, to not resist them, to not oppose them. The second option is to fight them, to oppose them, to confront and battle them. Ultimately, you'll be defeated because you can't win a battle against a sea of troubles. And the third choice here that's being presented is this idea you can oppose the sea of troubles and end them, ironically, end them by taking your own life. And then we have to die to sleep. So you could see this as the third option, the option of suicide, or it could be that Hamlet's moved on here and he's now simply thinking about what death means, to die, to sleep, no more. And so Hamlet's making an analogy between death and sleep. And no analogy is perfect, of course, but this idea here, death is a kind, I mean, when you go to sleep at night, you do experience, remember, a kind of death, particularly during these states of dreamless sleep. Last night I had a good 6 hours dreamless sleep. At least I can't remember any of the dreams that I experienced. So during that 6 hour period, for all intents and purposes, I was in an unconscious state and therefore a state quite similar to death. Of course, my brain was still functioning and, you know, taking care of business and so forth. But nevertheless, to die is a kind of sleep, to die, to sleep no more. In other words, to be in a state of unconsciousness, to no longer exist. And to no longer exist means to no longer suffer, to die, to sleep no more. And by a sleep, to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. And underscore that word heartache, this idea of, well, it could suggest certainly a psychological pain. And Hamlet, remember, is undergoing a psychological crisis here. It has been since the beginning of the play. But it also, I guess, well, we do. Let's just leave it with this idea of psychological pain or torment that one suffers. Um, it could be it no, it could also be the idea of loss too, the loss of a loved one I'm thinking of in particular here, because Hamlet has lost his father, and he was, remember, he did really worship his father like a god, like Hyperion. So, yes, the heartache here could be referring, I think, maybe uh, here it's also referring to this idea of the loss of a loved one. To say to die, to sleep no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. Here, I think the natural shocks is referring to physical pain, physical traumas. Uh, and this is what each of us, what all feeling organisms inherit when they are, right, when they come into the world. This is their inheritance. This is what all flesh is heir to. But Hamlet, of course, is speaking of human beings. This idea, the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. We human beings, right? We're vulnerable. Our flesh is vulnerable, and therefore we can be harmed, we can be injured. Uh, and this is what we inherit when we come into the world. This is our natural birthright, if you will. This idea of being harmed by the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. The thousand, I think a realist might say that's a bit of an understatement. Only a thousand? Uh, but at any rate, uh, let's continue here. Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. This idea of dying, a kind of sleep, and dying and death, right? It's a kind of consummation that with dying, with death comes the cessation of all physical and mental harm, all trauma, all natural shocks, all heartaches. So it's a kind of marriage, isn't it? A kind of the perfect marriage, if you will, with death, with unconsciousness. Death is like sleep. With unconsciousness, with death, comes the end of pain, of suffering. So once again, this is the tragic plot line that Hamlet is subscribing to here. That this is what is of most value, suffering. It is of real value. It is of most value. So he continues to die, to sleep. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. Uh, that word devoutly is interesting as well, isn't it? It's suggesting this idea of this is the ultimate uh, uh, is the ultimate desire, the ultimate longing. Uh, Even and remember, Hamlet is a Christian. For the Christian, the ultimate desire or longing is to be with his or her God. That would be the ultimate consummation, right? The consummation to be one with God, the Christian God. But here we've got this wish, this devout wish, a new kind of consummation is not death and an afterlife with the Christian God, but rather this idea of death and the end, the termination of all harm. And he continues here. He's lost in thought. He's reflecting upon this holy union, this holy marriage, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. And suddenly, perchance to dream, suddenly you see Hamlet, his romantic worldview here rises before him. Because remember, the romantic doesn't believe that consciousness ends with death like the realist does. The romantic believes in a non material, an immaterial entity, something that's non physical, uh, uh, something called a soul. And so consciousness doesn't cease with the death of the physical body. The soul lives on. And so, this idea, again, the analogy is continued here, this idea that in sleep, for the romantic, it's not comparable to death, because with sleep comes dreams. For the romantic, the dream is the dream of the afterlife, the world to come. To sleep, perchance to dream. There's the rub. That's a problem. When you consider, for the romantic who considers that there is an afterlife, that there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, yes, you want to know why. Why is that a problem? And Hamlet explains here, for in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil? What dreams may come? So you notice the doubt that with the words perchance to dream, here again, Hamlet's faith perhaps is wavering, momentarily. He's questioning, uh, is there really an afterlife? Is there really such a thing as a soul? Is there a world to come? Perchance to dream, with that word perchance. And then again, what dreams may come. Again, that suggestion that Hamlet, remember, as a man of faith, within the context of faith, it's very easy for many people to doubt, because there is no foundation, there is no support, there is no evidence beyond a rational doubt that can support one's belief in a supernatural world. So the individual of faith often is prone to these periods of doubt and temporary skepticism, if you will, as to the reality of a supernatural world. There's the rub. For in that sleep of death, notice the analogy again, that sleep of death, what dreams may come. So, in contrast, the realist would say the sleep is dreamless. There is no world to come. With the death of consciousness, with the death of consciousness, with the death of the body comes the death of consciousness. Um, Remember, we talked about in class, the realist argues that consciousness is an illusion, that it doesn't, illusions exist in the world. Remember, we said last time that when you see a magician performing a magic trick, right? When the magician pulls suddenly the bird appears out of the magician's hand. It looks as if the magician created the bird out of nowhere. Poof, magic, and suddenly the bird from nothing, something comes, and the illusion itself that the magician has created out of nothing something that exists. You see the illusion, it exists in the world, but it is an illusion, right? In other words, there's a natural explanation, a logical explanation, a physical explanation, if you will, behind that illusion. So we know that the bird is really concealed within the magician's sleeve, and that magicians with a lot of practice, they can be very quick and deft with their hands and so forth. And so it looks like the bird comes from nowhere, suddenly magically pops into existence out of nowhere. It's an illusion. The illusion is real, but it's not real. It's not really, the bird really doesn't appear out of nowhere. I think I mentioned that. Remember, Einstein once said that time is the greatest of all illusions. No, I would argue that consciousness, I'm sorry, Einstein, I would argue that consciousness, perhaps, I could be wrong, But consciousness is the greatest of all illusions. It feels like there is something separate from the body inside us. But remember, I've argued that consciousness is like the computer screen on your laptop, and that the brain produces consciousness, it produces this illusion. It happened during the evolutionary process. It feels real to us. It feels like it's some separate, it feels like there's a little me inside and pulling all the levers of my brain and pushing all the buttons and it feels like the little me inside is the master of my fate and the captain of my ship, my body, and it's doing all the work and I'm freely choosing. But it's really the brain that's making the choices because of the particular experiences that I've had in life, the particular circumstances I'm in. The brain is the central processing unit. The brain is making all the decisions, and some of those decisions I see my brain making uh, uh, appear on the laptop screen. I'm aware of them. That's what we call consciousness. But it is an illusion. There really is no little me inside. Uh, though it feels that way. But at any rate, this idea here that Hamlet is thinking of what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, he's worried here, isn't he? He's frightened of the afterlife. What dreams may come, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub, there's the problem, there's the impediment, the obstacle, the things to come, the afterlife, which is ironic, isn't it? Uh, I imagine that most people of faith, most religious people, they tend to think that they themselves, personally, that they are going to ascend into heaven or paradise or whatever their particular faith-based beliefs views support. Um, but here, Hamlet is contemplating something else. Perhaps the Christian hell, or perhaps the purgatory that the ghost, remember, the ghost claims to be in a kind of a purgatory, a realm where his all the crimes that he committed when he was living are now being burnt and purged away. So, a kind of purgatory or a kind of hell is something to be dreaded, something to be feared by the man of faith. And Hamlet is, I would argue, still a man of faith here. What dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. We must pause. We must think. We must reflect on that. This is a problem for the romantic because if you posit an afterlife, particularly an afterlife with not only a heaven, but also a hell, a place of eternal torture and torment, well, that might give you pause, particularly if you're reflecting on this idea of taking your own life and you also, uh, 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 you know, support this view that doing so is a mortal sin and punishable by uh, an eternal hell of horror and suffering must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. That's why Hamlet's saying, that's why we endure the agony and the anguish, all the harms that we endure, the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to, the heartache, the outrageous fortune, the sea of troubles. That's why people endure, is because they pause, they wait, they think, and suddenly they imagine there might be something in the afterlife that's far worse. That gives us, there's the respect. There's the thought, right? There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. People willing to endure, to suffer a long, long life of calamity. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time? And here we have a rhetorical question. Hamlet already knows the answer to this question, but he's going to begin. And we get a long list here of all of the kinds of harms, all of the kinds of dangers that human beings are exposed to once they are in the world, once they exist. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time? Notice it's a burden one must bear. This burden, this heavy burden of existing in the world. And this first idea is the whips and the scorns of time. I'm certainly feeling those myself. The whips and scorns of time. Time is seen as a kind of slave driver, right, with the whips and the scorns. And we know that if you live long enough, you will, you begin to deteriorate, you begin to decay, you begin to rot. And it can be a very slow and agonizing process, the aging process. And then, of course, there's the dying process, and that too can be quite uh, uh, painful. The dying process itself. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time? So time is seen as our enemy. Time, the whips and scorns, the slave. I imagine a slave driver here with his whips and his scorns. Who would bear the whips and scorns of time? The oppressor's wrong, those who have power over us, and they use that power to harm us. This idea of many people in the world with power use that power for their own benefits, for their own gain. The idea of might makes right, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely. And here you have the idea of, we all carry this ego around with us, and some people, their ego gets the better of them, and they become quite arrogant and quite self interested, self centered. And their disdain for others, particularly those, there are many people I would argue uh, well, it just depends. It could be a particular class, or it could be people who have a particular skill. They see themselves as somehow privileged, somehow more deserving than others. Uh, and so somehow others don't matter uh, uh, nearly as much as they do. The proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love. Ah, there. Here we have this idea of love here. And remember from A Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare in that play presents a very realistic and tragic view of romantic desire. For Shakespeare, I argued, love is a four-letter word. It's biased, it's prejudiced, it's nepotistic, it's racist, it's my race, it's nepotistic, my family, my children. They are what matter. I love them most. It's sexist, my sex. And my sex is better. My sex is more important. It can be heterosexist or is there a word? Homosexist. My sexual orientation is, you know, better. Um, well, I could go, my species, right? Some people imagine, some human beings think that their species is better than other species. And we see Hamlet is vulnerable to that idea too. Remember his speech to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, right? Man is the paragon, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And I argued in Midsummer Night's Dream that Shakespeare believes that, yes, man with his intelligence has this capacity, this ability to be rational and therefore to be ethical. And man is in a position, human beings are in a position to prevent unnecessary harm, but that we very often, more often than we, for the most part, we're so self-involved and self-interested, and we want our own needs and our own desires met that we don't think rationally and we don't behave ethically. So, in that sense, man is with that potential. He fails to live up to that potential. Human beings actually are worse than the animals, the other species on the planet, because they know. They have knowledge. They acquire knowledge, and they know they're causing unnecessary harm, and yet they continue to do so. Whereas the animals aren't aware that they're causing unnecessary pain. So yes, this idea of love, despised love, the pangs of despised love. We remember all of the obstacles in the Midsummer Night's Dream, all of the pain and the suffering that the lovers experience in that play, and how the play was many moments in the play it was moving toward a tragic end, and only because Shakespeare interferes with through the use of the supernatural fairies and the magical flower juice. Only through the means of the supernatural is Shakespeare able to resolve the problems that arise in relationships based on love and desire, romantic desire. Uh, we argued that the realist made the point that Shakespeare can't find a solution for this game. This game of love can't be won. In the end, everybody loses in the game of love. That For the realist, that's how the realist would say if you can manage to not participate in that game, then don't do it because you will lose in the end. And here we see despised love, the pangs of despised love. And although we're not going to talk at great length in any detail on Hamlet's relationship with Ophelia in this play, I just don't have the time. But it would make a really good essay for some of you if you're interested in the relationship between Ophelia and Hamlet. Uh, for option B, I think that would be make an that would be a good topic idea to explore if you're interested. Now that you have a better understanding, I think, of Shakespeare's take or Shakespeare's plays, I should argue, the plays how they view love, romantic desire. The pangs of despised love. And the list just goes on. The law's delay, the insolence of office, people again in positions of authority, positions of power, how they abuse that power, how they use it to take, to acquire, to gain. The law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin. This patience, the patient people in the world who have to suffer at the hands of the unworthy, it's been going on since time immemorial, since human beings existed, right? The patience that people have to endure when confronting others, people who are unworthy. What do you think Hamlet means by this idea of being unworthy? People who aren't, I would argue, people who aren't of any productive value. Hamlet sees Claudius as a man, as an unworthy man. Of course, this is Hamlet's view of Claudius. But Hamlet would argue that Claudius is not a man of productive value. He's not a man who's playing for the team called civilization. He's not in he's in the ball game because he wants to be the star. He wants to be the home run hitter. And he's not willing to sacrifice for the team because what's most important to the unworthy individual, what's most important is getting his name in the Baseball Hall of Fame. That's what's most important, making a name, that immortality project. That's what is most important, being remembered as someone who could hit a ball with a bat and could hit that ball a great distance. That's what's most important. Shakespeare would say, no, that's projected value. That's a projected value. That has no real value in the world. And for someone to be worthy, uh, uh, be considered to be of worth, of value, is someone who is the janitor out trying his best or her best to clean up the mess that is all around us, that we make, that we ourselves make, and that others make. Trying to clean up your own mess, trying to clean up as much of it as you can. You can't clean it all up. It's too late once you come into the world. But trying to make as little mess as you can and trying to clean a little bit of it up and trying as well to clean up other people's messes as much as you can. That is what is of real value. And so this is what has to be endured. We find ourselves in a world where people, their values, right there, they misconstrue, they misunderstand what's really important, and they spend their lives not contributing, not being productive, not being concerned with society's ills and problems and needs and wants, and not being concerned with striving to make this world one in which there is less pain and harm occurring, but rather they're in the game for themselves. They want to be king. They want to ascend to the throne. And that's what's most important to them. The patient merit of the unworthy, the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin. So Hamlet's saying, well, who would suffer all of these horrors, all of these abuses that existence entails? It comes with being alive. Who would do this when you could end all of that simply with a bare bodkin? You could pay your debt through your debt to existence. You could pay that off. This idea of a quietus. When he himself might his quietus make, might pay off his debt, you owe a debt, right? Everyone is going to have to pay for living, for being alive. You're going to have to pay with your death. You can't have one without the other. So paying your debt with death, the pun on debt and death, you see there, but that the dread of something, I'm sorry, and his quietus make, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin. Who would suffer all this when you could simply end it, terminate it now with a bare bodkin? You hear the alliteration of bare bodkin. There's a kind of violence in that too. I think Hamlet is being rather simplistic here, isn't he? I mean, I argued last time that for the most part, Hamlet is a rather poor philosopher. Here's an exception, though. Up to this point, Hamlet, uh, as far as this idea of the tragic plot line that he sees unfolding, that's spreading out before him, that's stretching out before him. Yeah, I would say that he's pretty much. I think I would be a realist would certainly agree with him, wouldn't he? This idea that life is essentially suffering. Yes, there are moments when that suffering, that pain is alleviated, moments that we call joy and pleasure and bliss, but that suffering is relentless, it is continuous, and it is inescapable as long as we are alive. And so all of these agonies that Hamlet lists here for us. Yeah, I think he's seeing clearly that this is what's of most value, this idea of suffering, that it trumps existence itself. Here, Hamlet doesn't believe that life is intrinsically valuable. And that's because I would argue that for the moment, he's not addicted any longer to life. He's lost his desires. Remember his very first soliloquy, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. This world is weary, it's stale, it's flat, it's grown monotonous, it's dull, and he can't find any use for it. He no longer has any desires, any needs that he wants met. So temporarily he's lost that addiction. He's not addicted to the heroin any longer. And he can see clearly that it doesn't have any real value, existence in and of itself. That what matters, right? What is of real value is suffering. And so, yeah, I think he gets that's right. Because of his depressed state, If you've ever been in a depressed state, I would never wish it on anybody, but it can be quite painful. And people who have been in depressed states will report, they will tell others that when they're in that state of depression, there's nothing that they want, nothing that they desire, and that some people are in such a debilitated state that if there were a wonder drug on the nightstand next to them, lying in bed in their depressed state, that they couldn't have the energy, the desire to reach out and take the drug that would end their depression. And as I said, I wouldn't wish depression on anybody, but there can be a benefit to depression, and that it can temporarily, while people are in states of depression, it can allow them to see clearly and to see that life itself is an addiction. It's life is the drug, and it's part of our programming. We can't escape it. We need machines. We have the need to feed, to consume. We're consumers, right? Biological consumers, psychological consumers, cultural consumers. Again, it can be reduced to this consumption, and we become addicted to it because we just can't tolerate uh, these states of lack, of want, of dissatisfaction. So yes, Hamlet. When he's asking this question, he says this idea of a bare bodkin. Here, as I said, for the most part, he's a poor philosopher, but here he gets it right. But then, when he says that we could end all of our troubles very simply with a bare bodkin, I think it's a rather horrific way to die, a bare bodkin. The idea falling on your sword. Again, that reminds me of the ancient Greek warrior falling on his sword. Shakespeare, another tragedy Shakespeare wrote called Antony and Cleopatra, about the great lovers, Antony and Cleopatra, the legendary lovers. Antony loses in battle. Antony, the famous Roman warrior, loses in battle against uh, Caesar's nephew. What was his name? Octavius. He loses in battle, and rather than be defeated by the enemy, rather than being paraded through the streets of Rome and being mocked and ridiculed as the loser to the great uh, Octavius, rather than being conquered and humiliated, he Antony attempts to fall on his own sword, attempts to take his own life. Remember, suicide is an ennobling act for uh, uh, the ancient Roman warrior, the ancient Greek warrior. It's a way to say no to the enemy. It's a symbolic act, if you will. It's to say, no, I may have lost the battle, but I'm not going to accept defeat. I'm not going to accept it. And this is the symbolic way I have of denying you your victory by falling, by taking my own life. And it's the soldier sees it as a courageous act. The warrior sees it as an act of courage. But when Antony falls on his own sword in that play, in Shakespeare's play, Shakespeare's tragedy, Antony and Cleopatra, he botches it. I mean, it doesn't penetrate his heart. And so he doesn't die. It doesn't take him seconds to die. It takes him the remainder of Act Five to die. And he does die a very slow and horrific, painful death. So this idea that it's really very simple, if you wish to take your own life, and also this idea of doing violence to yourself, I think uh, that can be very difficult for most people, I would imagine, to overcome that fear of doing physical harm to your body. Uh, yeah, I don't think it's quite as, some people might argue, well, if Hamlet's so distraught and so distressed, why doesn't he simply kill himself? It's kind of a glib response, isn't it? To do violence to oneself can be quite difficult. and certainly not a dignified way to end one's existence. And it's not always successful. You hear about the horror stories of people who failed in their attempt to commit suicide. And I don't even like that phrase, commit suicide, because it does. We use that expression to commit suicide, but it suggests a kind of crime or a kind of doing something that's wrong, which raises this question of suicide, which we'll talk about in just a moment. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. But no, I would say that Hamlet here, this idea of the bear bodkin, Hamlet's not thinking clearly here. He's not thinking rationally, is he? Uh, it's not as simple as that, I would argue. It's kind of a romantic view of suicide, the idea that you can simply take your own life and with ease and without any hesitation or fear. Who would, and he continues another rhetorical question here. He knows the answer already here, doesn't he? Who would Fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death. So this idea of who would Fardels bear, the burdens of existence, and again that word bear, he repeats that word, that bears reminding you that he repeats the word bear. This idea of this heavy load, this heavy burden that we each have to carry with us. Who would Fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life? You can really see the struggle. Whenever I read these lines, I'm always reminded of the working class. You know, you and me, we're part of the working class, and we will, at the beginning of your career, it can seem quite exciting and challenging and new, but I don't know, the 10, 20, 30, 40 years, it can perhaps become a fardel, a burden to carry to grunt and sweat through. It can become wearisome and can take its toll on one. And of course, this idea that one has to work to survive. Uh, and I would argue that work is work. I mean, it's not relaxation and entertainment. I mean, there can be excitement in some of the challenges that come along with it, but there realistically, of course, let's remember that a lot of it can be quite tedious, quite monotonous, and quite difficult. Uh, this idea of a Fardos bearing to grunt and sweat under a weary life. The imagery here is very vivid, isn't it? Who would Fardos bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death. There's that idea again. Here's why people endure, according to Hamlet, who is a romantic who imagines an afterlife. But unlike, I would argue, the typical romantic who imagines an afterlife in living in bliss, in paradise, having, ascending into heaven, here Hamlet is thinking, well, perhaps there's something worse to come. Uh, what makes what makes a person assume that the afterlife is going to be all joy and bliss and happy, eternal happiness? What makes one assume that it's a happily ever after? Not for some Christians, perhaps, right, who are living in hell and for an eternity. For them, it's a horrific ever after. They're living horribly ever after as opposed to happily ever after. Ooh, there's a good title for your essay. Living horribly ever after. Who would Fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns? The undiscovered country. And the realist would argue no such country exists. It can never be discovered because it isn't there. There is no such place, but Hamlet sees it as the undiscovered country from whose boundary no traveler returns. So once you cross the borderline from existence into death, no traveler returns. Now, some critics argue that this is a mistake in the play because we have the ghost who has returned uh, from death. But here, one critic argues, and I think he makes a good point, the idea that no one returns alive. When someone dies, no one returns alive. Um, this is what Hamlet means. No one returns alive to report what is on the other side, because Hamlet believes in the other side. And so, someone who dies for the romantic who dies, no romantic will return. A traveler returning and report what exists on the other side. So, this idea that no one comes back alive. But I was thinking about what that critic said. Hamlet, being a good Christian, he probably should remember his story, the stories he was told in Bible class, and I'm sure he knows the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead uh, by the Christian God in the New Testament. So, yeah, but perhaps that's underscoring again a moment of doubt in Hamlet's mind. Maybe I'm stretching that point a bit here, but nevertheless, you'd think that Hamlet would remember that particular story. I mean, after all, that's quite an extraordinary claim that his religious text is making that people can be raised from the dead miraculously; they can return to life. So I would also argue the people who say, "Well, the ghost has returned from death." I would argue that they can't know anything about this ghost. This is what the ghost claims. But is it even a ghost? Hey, how could anyone know? I mean, if it is some sort of supernatural being, what possibly could we know about it? We could call it a ghost, we could name it a ghost, and then we could give it this is the particular characteristics of a ghost. But the idea of a ghost suggests that someone, right, the ghost is some sort of spirit that once existed for the romantic in a physical body. How do we know that's true here of the ghost, that it once was a living being, that it once was the elder King Hamlet? And that it has returned. It died, and it has a spirit and a soul, and it has returned to the world, the living world. It has been released from purgatory, or a realm similar to purgatory, and it's here now. In that's how do we know any of this? Again, that problem with the definition of the supernatural itself. How can anyone have access to a realm that is above and beyond human comprehension? If such a realm exists, the realist would certainly not even consider, not even have an open mind when it comes to this supernatural realm, at least not beyond a rational doubt. At any rate, who would fart or spare to grunt and sweat under weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have and fly to others that we know not of. So Hamlet has the answer to the questions he's raised. Why do people endure existing, continuing to live, continuing to be, when life is essentially suffering, hardship? Why would people do it? And here, as I've argued, I think Hamlet gets the idea that life is essentially suffering. I think he gets that right. But this idea that people endure the suffering because of this fear of an afterlife, that certainly may be true of some people. But I would argue first that many people of religious belief, faith, they imagine a better world, that's what they're going to be going to. Their souls or spirits will be moving, passing into a better world, not a world of that is perhaps to be feared or dreaded. They can't imagine themselves eternally uh, uh, suffering in such a place. And certainly for the realist certainly doesn't subscribe to these ideas um, of you know, a place called hell or Hades or however you want to call it, purgatory, however you want to label it. It puzzles the will, he says, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. So we suffer here because we fear, right? Hamlet's beliefs is we fear that the suffering to come will be perhaps far greater. Thus, conscience does make cowards of us all. Conscience, both the idea that, well, first the idea of conscience, this idea that there is a perceiving once again that taking one's own life is a mortal sin. This idea that to do so is to go against the desires, the will of the Christian God, an all powerful God. And therefore, it would be morally punishable. It would be a moral sin and punishable by damnation, eternal damnation. But conscience also here means consciousness, the idea that being aware of this possibility of another world, a world to be dreaded, to be feared. That's just being aware of that. That's what makes cowards of us all. Notice the alliteration with conscious, pardon me. Thus, conscience does make cowards of us all. It's this idea of it's a moral crime, a moral sin. Conscience, that's what makes us cowards. And I would argue it makes perhaps some romantics cowards. Hamlet is imagining that here. Perhaps it makes Hamlet a coward, is this idea, his belief that committing suicide would be a mortal sin. And conscience in the sense of consciousness, being aware, for Hamlet, being aware of this afterlife, this this not so very pretty picture of the world to come, of a world to come, that being aware of that makes him a coward also. Conscience does make cowards of us all. Interesting take, isn't it? I mean, still in our society in the United States here, suicide is taboo, and we use the phrase commit suicide, and we call many people refer to people who take their own lives as cowards, uh, that they couldn't, suffer through it. Again, I would say rather glib response to somebody's pain, and certainly, uh, an irrational response. um, but this idea that committing suicide is cowardly, it's a cowardly act. Here, Hamlet is saying uh, this idea of being aware that it's a mortal sin, that not committing suicide becomes a cowardly act because of the person's fear, the dread of a possible hell, the possible hell, Christian hell to come. That's the cowardly act, not committing suicide. And this awareness for the romantic, in this case, Hamlet being the Christian, for the Christian here, or for the Christian Hamlet, this awareness of this other place called hell, that prevents him, his fear of being eternally damned in that particular place of fire and brimstone. And that is what, you know, puts fear, makes him fearful. And so, again, it's a cowardly, not committing, not taking his own life, not ending his own life, becomes a cowardly act. And thus, the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with a pale cast of thought. This idea of being resolved to end the suffering, right? This native hue of resolution suggests that, this one who is uh, 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 desirous and willing and thinking correctly here, perhaps. That idea, this native hue of resolution, one who is determined to take this particular course, is sicklied o'er with a pale cast of thought. So, native hue of resolution, this idea that one is ready and determined and wants to end the suffering, wants to take the courageous act, the courageous way by ending his own existence. And yet, that idea is sicklied o'er, this native hue, this healthy. It's an interesting metaphor here that's being. The native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er, becomes pale and sickly with the pale cast of thought. The idea of this fear, this pale, this dread, this pale cast of this sort of horrific afterlife is sickly or with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pitch and moment with this regard their currents turn awry. Again, it could be repeating the same idea of this enterprise, taking one's own life, of great pitch and moment, because it would be a way of saying no. Again, symbolically saying no to the suffering that that comes hand in hand with existence. It's an enterprise of great pitch and moment, of great importance and great significance. You could see it as a kind of symbolic act, a way of saying no. Um, I often see, I see trash in my neighborhood, and I know I go and pick up the trash that I see on the street or in the gutters or people's lawns, and I see people toss trash in their own neighborhoods, and I know that it's kind of pointless to me to keep going out there and picking up the trash, but it's kind of a way of standing up and saying no. It's a symbolic act on my part. No, I say no to polluting the planet. No, I say no to that, or no to uh, the dangers that come with the pollution here. Even though I see, I, I can't be a defeatist ultimately. I have to at least strive. This is the way what Hamlet might be saying here. Enterprises of great pitch and moment, with this regard their currents turn awry. That's another fascinating metaphor. The currents turn awry. The idea, of a river that's rushing headlong in one direction, of course, a river rushing to the sea. In this case, to be overwhelmed by the sea, but rushing forward toward that sea at any rate. And the problems will be resolved. The problems will end. One will uh, drowned in that sea, be overwhelmed, but the problems themselves, ironically, paradoxically, will come to an end. But here, instead of the river being purposeful and driving towards that ocean with the intent of ending all the harm, all the suffering that existence entails, that life brings with it, instead, the currents turn awry because of this thought, this dread in Hamlet's mind, Hamlet the romantic, Hamlet who holds this belief in the supernatural. The currents turn awry and lose the name of action. So the river loses its force, it loses its drive, its power, as it's right. its intention as it's moving toward the sea. And the currents, right, they turn awry, they turn off into minor tributaries and ultimately uh, form still lakes and ponds or evaporate. I like that better. They form still lakes and ponds where they sit, the pale cast of thought, sickly door, and there they sit and suffer and endure. So, yeah, this soliloquy quite powerful. The ideas that it presents. I was thinking two possible topics for option C. For those of you who enjoy writing argumentation essays, if you'd like to look at these controversial issues, uh, once again, we see here this soliloquy touches on the anti-natalism argument, which we discussed in when we were analyzing A Midsummer Night's Dream. And if you recall, it's a rather awkward term, anti-natalism, but the idea is anti-procreation. If you recall, the argument is made, and remember, this is not my argument. This is the argument precedes me. I'm simply presenting it to you because I have personally been unable to find a sound counter argument to it. But the argument goes something like this: remember, as long as in the realm of non-existence, nothing exists, so nothing can be harmed. But once people procreate, once they bring children into the world, these beings now exist, and so therefore they can be harmed. Uh, and the first problem for the anti-natalist is this idea of need that you create or you bring into being. You produce a need machine, the need to feed, and that the child, and as it throughout its life, as it develops and matures and so forth, that being will constantly be in this state of need and constantly wanting and lacking and being frustrated, often frustrated. And even when those states are temporarily met, even when those harms are temporarily assuaged or uh, 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 ended, that others rise in their place. And so it is a continuous need. It's this idea of consumption. It's part of the evolutionary process. It's our brain's primary function. This idea of constantly needing. It's what motivates the living, feeling organism. It's what this need is the basis for reward and punishment. It what motivates us to move away from that which harms, which punishes. And I remember I made the argument earlier that there really is no such thing as a true reward, a true pleasure, a genuine pleasure in and of itself. That all pleasures, if you think about them carefully, and think about them deeply, that all pleasures ultimately are just an alleviation of harms. And I made that extra credit assignment. Hey, let's throw that one out too, an extra credit assignment. Can you think of a genuine pleasure? Or are all pleasures, as the argument that I'm making, are all pleasures ultimately a reduction or an alleviation or in some way a termination of harm? I've never been able to think of one. And as you drive about St. Charles, you can look at every, we live in this materialistic universe. You look at everything that's been, uh, look at the culture around us. Everything is built around this idea of trying to escape harm, some sort of pain or problem. So the first problem is when you bring a being into the world, a human being into the world, you create a need machine, the need to feed, and it's endless. And the second problem, of course, is risk. And the moment you bring of being into the world, you expose them to all sorts of risks. And the risks here that Hamlet, I would argue, it has a rather clear picture of. Because of his depressed state, it's allowed him, at least at this moment here, to see more clearly, to see the larger picture, to see that, he talks about we. It's about the team, the risk that beings are exposed to when they come into the world. We remember the birth defects and the fairy blessing at the end of A Midsummer Night's Dream. And here, of course, the thousand natural shocks, the heartache, the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. We think of the natural diseases and the natural disasters that we're all, or that a being could harm a being. Uh, uh, and then, of course, we think of outrageous fortune. This idea of this belief in accidents. Of course, as a determinist, there are causal factors behind each what appears to be a random event, but it looks like it's a random event, fortune, outrageous fortune. It looks like, right, that it was simply bad luck, mischance. But think of all the accidents. Hamlet talks about outrageous fortunes in this speech. And he also talks about despised love. So I don't know if you can fall back on this idea of, love makes the world go round, and love ultimately is what makes suffering worth it in the end, because Shakespeare, as we saw in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and again in this play, and the relationship between Ophelia and Hamlet, and between Hamlet and his mother as well, or Hamlet and his father, you can see all of the problems that are raised because of this particular psychological need or addiction. And remember, our culture feeds this addiction, right? It tells us, it promotes love. It says it's the greatest of all emotions, and all you need is love, and love makes the world go round, and love is a many splendored thing. It's in all our romantic comedies and our television series, and in our songs, and it's everywhere around us. This idea of love, but here Hamlet says despised love. Interesting too. And he also, of course, gives this long list of human abuse, right? The oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the insolence of office. And we're reminded when a human being comes into the world that they are vulnerable to human abuse, to becoming victims of human abuse, And there's also Hamlet himself is going to say it's better. He tells Ophelia in the very next on the very next page, it would be better if his mother had never given birth to him, if he'd never been born, because he himself is only indifferent honest, that he's a man who's proud and ambitious and revengeful. So it's the idea that you bring a human being into the world, that human being could grow up to be a victimizer, an abuser. So people give birth to children, for example, who are molested, and people who grow up, they give birth to children who grow up to be child molesters, for example. So there's this problem that's raised too, this litany, this long list of abuse, of human abuse that Hamlet mentions here. And then, of course, there's the whips and scorns of time. You bring someone into the world, and the antinatalist says that if that being lives long enough, it's going to slowly, it's going to have to go through the aging process. It's going to have to go through the process of deterioration. And that can be a long, slow, very difficult, painful process. This idea of time, aging, and then the dying process. Again, romantics' view of dying is they romanticize the dying process itself, but most of us, the majority of us, will die in a hospital room with tubes. I laugh, I'm only out of fear, out of horror here, but the idea that, yeah, most of us will, our deaths are not going to be pretty. Most deaths are not, or I don't know about most, but many deaths are not quick, relatively quick or painless, relatively painless. Many are slow and agonizing. And then, of course, there's death itself. Remember, I've stated before in class that we're the only species on the planet. We're aware. We understand the concept of death. We know that we are mortal, that we are going to die, and that even for romantics, as well, of course, for realists, just the thought, the idea of no longer existing, can be psychologically frightening. And particularly the loss of those we love, too. I know I always use that phrase from The Wizard of Oz, the wicked witch who tells Dorothy when she's got Dorothy and her friends cornered, that the last to go will see the first three go before her, and her little dog, too. It's the idea that if you do survive long enough, all those you love, all those you care about, including your doggies, all those people you care about, you're going to experience loss, like Hamlet experiences the loss of his father, the heartache he mentions in the to be or not to be soliloquy. So there's the whips and scorns of time and the heartache, not to mention those fardels that we all have to bear, particularly we people in the working class, uh, have to earn our sustenance. And we'll spend most of our lives working. Remember, we'll spend more times with, well, not lately, of course, because we're all online now, but, if the routine ever returns to, uh, the way it was previously, most people spend most of their lives, the majority of lives, with the people, their fellow employees, rather than with the people they care most about, their loved ones. So, yeah, the anti-natalist would say all of these risks and all of these dangers, and that we are, Americans, irrationally, unfortunately, but Americans love to play the lottery. For some reason, they think they don't have to earn. They should be exempt from having to contribute to society, contribute to civilization. That they shouldn't have to earn. They shouldn't have to work toward making a better world. That they should just be given billions of dollars. So I would say that's irrational thinking and certainly causes a lot of unnecessary harm, this idea of the lottery. But there is another lottery. There are all these lotteries that we end with that we are automatically entered in. The anti-natalist, the realist would argue all of these lotteries we're in, not all of them, but you know, if you're a man, for example, you're not entered into the lottery of dying because of complications from pregnancy or during childbirth. But many of these lotteries, for most of us, or for all of us, we're entered in many of these lotteries, right? There's the cancer lottery. I think, what are the latest scientific statistics? I think it's 1 out of 6 people die of cancer. There's the cancer lottery, and then a host of others, of course. The Alzheimer's lottery. Uh, there's that one to fear, and there's the heart disease lottery, and then of course the natural dying in a natural disaster lottery. All these the accident lottery. There's even the lottery of being hit by lightning. I mean, you have more chance of winning the Missouri lottery than being hit by lightning, uh, but it's still a possibility that you could be hit by lightning. Some people, that happens to them. And then, yes, but that's rare, yeah. But we're in that lottery. And most of us, I would argue, are in that lottery. So there's the idea. And the analyst also argues this notion that not only do parents write Hamlet's mother. Remember Hamlet at the beginning of Act One, just reminding me of these lines. He says, the time is out of joint. Oh, cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right. He really resents having been brought into the world because now he's got this mess he's got to clean up. But it's this idea of We're not in control. We aren't the masters of our fate, the captain of our ship. According to the determinists, where all the scientific experiments, the data points is that we aren't in control. So when you bring a child in the world, you think you might have control. You already have some control, right? I mean, you can take all you have are probabilities, but you're bringing a child into the world according to the determinists. You're bringing the child into a universe of inevitability. Particularly, your death is inevitable. The idea of bringing a child into the world really is a death sentence. But you're not in control. You're certainly not in control of death, but you're not in control, in a universe of inevitability, that all you can go on is you can use your intelligence and you can imagine possible disasters arising and take precautions and try to prevent those disasters. And your probabilities may go higher, but nevertheless, there's certainly no guarantee. Sometimes the very precautions that you take are what actually can lead to uh, disaster, catastrophe. Remember, there's a percentage of children, for example, who, when they're die because of the safety belts they were put in when they're in cars. It's because they were wearing that particular that safety belt. That's what caused their death. So there is this inevitability. No one is in control. The anti-natalist also says who is qualified, who is competent to raise children. I mean, no one even has to take a test for bringing someone to the world and raising that being. No one has to. No one's ever tested on that. We have to take a driver. We have to take a driver's license. We have to take a driver's test to get a license to drive a car. But to bring a child to the world, nobody has to take. Nobody has to take any sort of test whatsoever. A lot of people bring children into the world and they haven't even built a proper nest. Even birds know you build a nest first before you bring the child into the world. So a lot of people, they just don't, they aren't competent, the anti-natalists would argue. And certainly this idea of, once the mess is made, once the milk has been spilled, you just can't clean it up. So the responsibility ultimately falls on the parents. Interesting that Hamlet mentions, after hearing the ghost story, those lines, the time is out of joint, oh cursed spite that ever I was born to set it right. The idea that his father, or at least what he believes to be the ghost of his father, is putting this very heavy burden, this responsibility on him. The time is out of joint. It's like dislocating. Hamlet's like a kind of physician, a kind of doctor. I would hate to live the life of a doctor, to spend your entire life in a place out of joint, and you're constantly trying to set those joints right. It's like a bone that's been pulled out of joint, and you've got to replace that bone, and you're going to have to cause harm to do that. Yeah, certainly would be envious of that. But Hamlet, this idea that it's the ghost of his father whose place is burdened. And then he talks, as I said earlier, about he tells Ophelia that because of who Hamlet is, because he's proud and ambitious and revengeful, that his mother would have been better off not to have given birth to him. So the responsibility ultimately falls on the shoulders of the parents. Ultimately, whatever happens to the being that's brought into the world in a deterministic universe, that's where the responsibility falls. And we can say that in one sense, they're not responsible because it is a deterministic universe, but it's just a fact that they brought the being into the world. That's still a fact. So that fact can't, there's no way around that fact. And that responsibility, the fact that they brought that person in the world, and they did so without consent. You can't get consent from a non existent being, but does that mean that just because you can't get consent, that you have the right to take it? I guess that the realist, the anti-natalist would argue that if you can't get consent, then you don't have the right to take it. If you can't get it, it's a fact. You can't get consent. If you know that there's any possibility at all that what you do could cause harm, and you can't get consent from that other being, whether that being exists or not, if you can't get consent, you know of that possibility that it could cause harm. Well, you know it's going to end in death, that it is a death sentence. Then just because you can't get consent doesn't mean you have the right. Might does not make right. That one has to be rational. Say, if I can't get consent, then I'm not going to take it. If I can't get it, I can't take it. The responsibility becomes greater if you can't get someone's consent. If I take my neighbor's money and head off to Las Vegas and bet all his money without his consent, without his knowing, then I better be guaranteed I'm going to win in Vegas. If I can't be guaranteed I'm going to win, then you can see I'm causing unnecessary harm. And that responsibility falls on me. The responsibility becomes greater. It doesn't become less because you can't get consent. So I think if you look at Hamlet's soliloquy, the fourth soliloquy, the famous to be or not soliloquy, very important, very significant soliloquy, I think. It shows Hamlet's flaws, his weaknesses, and his strengths as a philosopher. I mean, I have to give him credit for some of the things he's saying here because of his particular circumstances and his depression, his melancholy. But yes, if you wanted to use this soliloquy as a kind of springboard into the antinatalism argument, if you're interested in option C, I think you could find quite a bit of research out there on that argument. Also, the question of suicide. For those of you who would like to do this as an extra, as option C, the question of suicide. Remember, I've argued that people have rights as long as those rights don't cause unnecessary harms. So the rapist doesn't have a right to rape, even though the rapist enjoys raping because it causes unnecessary harm, for example. So this idea, does a society have a right? Do we as a society have a right to prevent someone from ending his life? Do we have that right? And if you take the major premise, which is causing unnecessary harm, knowingly causing unnecessary harm to feeling organisms, to organisms that are conscious, that are sentient, that can feel harm, that knowingly causing unnecessary harm to feeling organisms is irrational and unethical. It's irrational thinking because you've misunderstood that 1 + 1 = 2, that a brain in pain is a brain in pain. Doesn't matter whose brain is in pain. It's still a bad thing because pain is intrinsically bad. Suffering is of real value. That's the argument that someone who sees, right, imagine the realist and someone with a realistic worldview and someone who sees the tragic plot line unfolding. A brain in pain is a brain in pain. Doesn't matter whose brain is in pain. That's intrinsically bad. So to cause unnecessary harm is bad, and it's also it's thinking irrationally. You've forgotten that basic math that 1 + 1 = 2 formula. Basic math. It's not complex. It's very simple. And it's also to cause unnecessary harm to a feeling organism is unethical. It's also behaving badly. Because if you're causing unnecessary harm, you can imagine you wouldn't want that done to you, so why are you doing it to someone else? If you're knowingly doing it. So in that sense, that it's ethically bad, that code of principles that's established from the scientific facts that the brain in pain is the brain in pain. It's ethically bad to do so. So that's the major premise, always the major premise here when it comes to these controversial issues, that knowingly causing unnecessary harm to conscious sentient organisms, in this case human beings, is irrational, both irrational and unethical. So now the minor premise becomes a society that prevents a rational individual from ending his existence with the assistance of a qualified physician is causing unnecessary harm. I'll say that again. You can pause it if you want, if you're interested in exploring this controversial issue. So the minor premise for the person who makes this argument, uh, uh, the person, in other words, who supports physician-assisted suicide, the idea is that a society that prevents a rational person from ending his existence through the assistance of a qualified physician is causing unnecessary harm. So if you take the major and the minor premise, you can conclude, you can add them up. 1 plus 1 equals 2, according to the realist here, according to the person who supports physician-assisted suicide. So if you take them together, then you can say that a society that prevents a rational individual from ending his existence with dignity through the assistance of a physician, in other words, relatively painlessly and relatively quickly. The person doesn't have to do violence to himself. He doesn't have to end his life because society has said you can't end your life. If you're going to end your life, you're going to have to harm yourself violently in some way. So, doing so, with ending his life with dignity through the assistance of a qualified physician, is therefore both irrational and unethical. It's a controversial issue. That means it's of great importance. So, either one of these arguments would make excellent essay topics. Option C. If you're the kind of person who likes a good argument, you can take either stand. You can either support the antinatalist argument or you can oppose it. All that I ask is that the argument you make be rational, that you offer reasons for your argument. I may disagree. I may say that your argument is rational, but it isn't sound. Remember, an argument, in order for us to arrive at a most important truth, an argument has to be both rational and sound. But nevertheless, I won't penalize you if I disagree with you, as long as you provide rational uh, reasons for your position. And the question of suicide. And in addition, extra credit points for both of these. If you don't want to write an essay, but you would like to consider these questions for the controversial issues, extra credit. I'll give a point for each. You can either agree with the antinatalist argument or with the assisted physician suicide argument. You can agree with that. If you agree, have a conversation with someone and report back what that person said. You don't have to tell me who that person is. You can just say, I had a conversation with someone and I made these arguments, and here's how this person responded. Because remember, remember, I think it's important. I think Shakespeare would think it's important that these controversial issues be addressed, be raised, that we talk about them. These controversial issues where we may be causing unnecessary harm. We don't wish to do that. We wish to use our ability to reason so that we can avoid doing that. If you disagree with the argument, make a counter argument. Okay? So either way, the same with the question of suicide. If you agree with the philosophical argument I made, you can have a conversation with someone and get an extra credit point. Or if you disagree with the argument, the philosophical argument that I made, then that the realist is making, right? Then you can, not only the realist makes that argument, well, not all realists would make that argument, but the realist who has this tragic view of the human story, that particular kind of realist. If you disagree, you can make a counter argument and get an extra credit point. If you agree, you can have a conversation. So I've given you lots of food for thought, lots to digest today. We're going to stop here with Hamlet in this mood, because next we're going to see him in a far different mood. He's in a different frame of mind. He's returning to that course of action he spoke of, the course of action he's about to undertake, and that is he's going to put a play on. He's interested in catching the conscience of Claudius. To catch the play's the thing in which I'll catch the conscience of the king. So for the next lecture, I would like you to specifically look at the scene, the play within the play that Hamlet has performed for King Claudius, and ask the question, do you think he catches the conscience of the king? So until then, thanks for being patient. Be gone.